Welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual Author Talks series. My name is Claire Haley. I am our Vice President of Democracy Initiatives and Author Talks here at the History Center. And it's absolutely my pleasure to be your host tonight for our Author Talk featuring author Phyllis Biffle Elmore. Her book is called Quilt of Souls. It is a memoir. It is available for purchase from Atlanta History Center's museum shop if you don't already have a copy. It's 25% off tonight only. Your purchase helps us at Atlanta History Center continue to offer this programming and helps the authors as they continue to promote their books. So thank you very much for considering making a purchase from us tonight. As we talk this evening, Phyllis and I are going to talk for a little while, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. As you think of those, we're going to use the Q&A feature to submit those. I'm going to close the chat here in a minute. So if you think of questions, please drop those in the Q&A. Sometimes we end up with more than we're able to get to, but I promise we will do our absolute best to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. Now, just a little bit about tonight's guest, and then we will move into the interview. Phyllis Biffle Elmore, she is a retired veteran of the United States Air Force and United States Army, whose civilian career has included working as a counselor for incarcerated youth, survivors of domestic violence, and people suffering from alcohol and substance abuse. She has a BA in sociology, minor in women's studies from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and a master's certificate in creative writing from the University of Denver. She was born in Detroit, spent much of her childhood in Alabama, which is what she'll be talking a lot about tonight, and currently lives in Florida with her husband, Reginald Elmore, and she has 7 granddaughters who are the love of her life. And as you'll learn tonight, she had a very special relationship with her grandmother. So I know that that's a really, really special thing for you, Phyllis. Phyllis, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so appreciative.
I'm glad to be here. Been waiting on this.
Yes, we have too. The book is great. And let me just start by saying that congratulations on the book. You had an interesting journey getting to this publication, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But what really struck me, it's a memoir, but it's so full of wisdom and stories. I couldn't put it down. It's a memoir of your early life, but it really shows how the pillars of your community poured into you and created their stories were such a part of your early life. And I just love watching how those stories became a part of your story. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So to start off our discussion, I thought it'd just be helpful to know for people who haven't yet had the opportunity to read the book. Most of this book takes place in Alabama, but you moved there when you were quite young. I was wondering if you just set up for us how did you get to Alabama? How old were you? And just tell us a little bit about your grandparents who you lived with down there.
Sure. Well, I consider myself a migration child because I was born in Detroit in 1953 to parents who migrated from rural Alabama to Detroit in the 1940s. And that was pretty typical. That was an anomaly where a lot of Blacks moved north for better opportunities. And a lot of times when they went north, due to financial issues that they may been encountering and having children that they really couldn't afford, it was pretty typical to send a child or two back south to their parents until they got on their feet. Sometimes children stayed the entire time until adulthood. Sometimes they only stayed a few years. But that was typical because just to move a little forward on that, in my 2-room school down in Birmingham, in rural Alabama, I think 75% of the 50 plus classmates were being raised by their grandparents. So that was pretty much the norm. But anyway, I was sent to my grandparents in 1957 from Detroit. Never had seen these grandparents before. So it was a pretty scary experience. Of course, I felt abandoned because I felt alone. I all of a sudden I was taken away from an environment that I was accustomed to a completely rural environment. And that was difficult. It took me a while to get acclimated to that rural environment because there was no running water. It was all outside toilet facilities. My grandparents raised or they raised or all their food stuff. We had farm animals who they slaughtered for our food, for our meats. And so it was just difficult, and I had to get used to that. And it took me a few months. I remember as a 4-year-old during that time, my first 3 or 4 months in the country, of just being really, really scared. I shook all the time. I was fearful of everything. I was fearful of the farm animals. I was fearful of people, so my grandmother, it was her that took me under her wing, so to speak. And it was this old quilt, because I guess she just had to find some way to stop me from shaking so much. And I wasn't shaking because it was cold. I was shaking out of fear. And she went to the smokehouse out back, and grabbed this old quilt it was about a little bit larger than a child's receiving blanket. And she swaddled me in this quilt. And I remember that so well. A lot of times I tell people that when you're a child at age, either when you suffer trauma or some type of traumatic event, you either going to remember it or you're going to just totally forget it. And I guess it was something about my grandmother and being swaddled in this blanket and the words that she said and how she sung to me that night and told me that this quilt would be with me and it would keep me warm for the rest of my life. And I think that really must have touched me deeply inside. So my grandmother spent years quilting. She was a quilter. She only made quilts from the clothing of people who had passed on, and people would bring their clothing to her in sacks, and she would take that clothing and make quilts out of it. My quilt that she gave me that night was incomplete. So she used the fabric or the clothing from her loved ones and from her family, from her ancestors, to complete my quilt, which took 10 years to complete. And that wasn't by accident. I think that was a plan, because my grandmother had a style to her quilting and the way she placed people's clothing in her quilts. And I'll let people read the book to find out. I don't want to give too much away. But my grandmother was born in 1883. She was born to both her parents were slaves. And she was born on the same plantation that her parents were enslaved. And they ended up staying on that plantation. And oftentimes I would ask her why they didn't move away. And she said she thought her mother thought that her children that were sold in slavery would one day return to that plantation. And I think that was typical for a lot of folks. But my grandmother had 3 siblings who were sold in slavery. And she never seen those children again. And they were sold when they were babies. And my grandmother would tell me the stories of those 3 children and her mother. And both her mother and her father stayed on that plantation. And then one night they suffered under the hands of the ex-slave master. They both perished. And my grandmother had one other sister who was older. And just to back up a little bit, my grandmother had always told me that her mother didn't think that she would have other children, because she was so heartbroken of her kids after her children were sold into slavery. But she did. She had my grandmother's older sister, Ella. Then my grandmother came along in 1883. But Ella, my grandmother's, both her parents perished in one night at the hands of the ex-slave master. So my grandmother had actually no one except for her children and grandchildren. And I think she told me those stories over and over again because I really do feel that she thought that one day I would find her ancestors. And that's what I set out to do after I got older. But to make a point, the way I grew up with elderly women, and my publisher had to point this out because sometimes you don't pay attention to anything unless you're putting it in writing. But I grew up in a community of older people who were born in the 1850s and the 1860s and all the way up to the 1890s. And I think these women had so many untold stories, and I would sit and listen to it. And it was almost like I was born to sit and listen to these untold stories that they told. So growing up with my grandparents, on a rural farm out in the middle of nowhere was an experience for me. But it turned out to be one of the best experience that I've ever could have had.
I mean, just what a gift, to
Yes.
grow up near these women with such, I mean, incredible stories, but also not incredible in some ways because it was what, the whole community was experiencing, but it's the stories that weren't making it over to the history books and weren't making it,
Exactly.
yeah, into the
Exactly.
public consciousness. You have one quote when you're talking about one friend of your grandmother, Miss Cooter,
Mhm.
how she was. You talk about how it wasn't until you got a little bit older that you realized that her very hard traumatic experiences of spousal abuse,
Mhm.
but then also her drive. She's an entrepreneur. She's, incredibly tenacious and,
Right.
manages. I mean, her children had such a better life than she had solely because of, the work that her hands put into making that life for them. But you
Right.
talk about how you didn't realize until you got older that she was a microcosm. You
Mhm.
said a microcosm of the lives led by many Black women from my grandmother's era. They fought the hard fight.
Right.
Um, can you talk a little bit about how you began to realize that those stories that you were hearing maybe were typical of a particular, type of individual or place, but weren't necessarily a universal story? When did that begin to sink in that these women had seen something just really, and I mean, they had seen so much history and not that long of their lives.
I think as I got older, it was interesting looking at it from the lenses of a child. But as I grew into adulthood, I started appreciating that more of the lives that they led. And especially Miss Cooter, who was a laundress. And you don't hear much about these women, but my grandmother used to drive it home that laundresses they had the most difficult job. You have maids and you have people who work in the white households, but the laundresses were their job was very, very difficult. And I can empathize with that because I had to do the same job down in the country for my grandparents. And the laundresses basically, Miss Cooter and her sister would pick up laundry from the whites in towns on Monday in a horse and wagon, and those same clothes was due to be delivered on Wednesday. On Wednesday, they would pick up Wednesday's clothes, and those clothes were due back on Friday. Now, the whites in town, they didn't care whether it rained or snowed or was a heat wave. They still expected the same expectation of the time and date for those clothes to be delivered. And they would have to wash outside in these big black pots and these big silver tubs and the fire. And they used to make their own soap out of devil live, which is a very potent type of material. And they would wash Monday through Friday. Sometimes my grandmother said that it would rain, so they would have to bring all the clothes inside, hang them all over the place, and at the same time, Cooter was in an abusive relationship with her husband, and she had two sets of twins. And her husband used to come home drunk and used to kick all the clothes over, and they would have to sit there and rewash the clothes. So not only was she dealing with the painstaking responsibility of having the clothes ready on those days, she also had to deal with that abusive husband. So there's an element brought into that we still have in today's society. You see that, and this woman, she works really, really hard, but she raised her children, sent them to college. Then their children sent their children back south so Kuda could raise them. And so it was a great story that my grandmother told me about Kuda and her sister, because I found myself in that story being raised again by grandparents or grandmothers specifically. And that was a very common theme. Women were quilters, they were butter churners, they were laundresses. They did a lot of things. And but the main goal that I'm trying to get through in the stories that I tell, I wanted to tell their stories because their stories are really untold. These are the women, the grandmothers that we forgot about over the years, because these women these grandmothers of the 1940s, 1950s, they were amazing at raising their children's children, but somehow we forgot about their accomplishments and what they did.
I mean, it's just incredible because they raise their children, their children's children, and they work the whole time while doing
Yes.
it, right? In a variety of capacities.
Yes.
And one person that just really, I mean, all of the stories in the book were deeply, deeply moving. But one person in particular, I want to make sure that we were able to talk about is Miss Jubilee,
Oh,
because she's an seems like a remarkable woman. Seemed like a very lucky person to be able to know. And she brought together, she was such a pillar of the community. She was a healer. So she brought a lot of wisdom from her life experiences. And she also had some connections to other families in the community that might not be apparent from the outset of her story. So, but she fascinated you when you were a child. So I was just wondering if you can talk about the first time you met Miss Jubilee. And for those in the audience who haven't yet gotten to meet her through your book, if you could just talk a little bit about her personality and her story and how she came into your grandmother's life as well.
okay. Miss Jubilee was she was born in slavery. No one really knew how old Miss Jubilee is. And so as I got older, I just kind of started putting pieces together where she had to be this age because this happened and this happened. But Miss Jubilee was one of my grandmother's friends. She was older than my grandmother, old enough to be her mother. But Miss Jubilee, we say, I guess she was born like in the 1850s, and she was born in slavery. And so the first time I visited her, my grandfather, I had a cousin Jeff, I used to call him, used to come and pick up my grandfather to take him to town to do the things that we couldn't raise or grow in the country. Sulfur, my grandmother used sulfur a lot, Coca-Cola and Kool-Aid. Those were the three things that they would pick up. That was a regular staple that they would pick up on town. But he would come and pick my grandfather up every 2 weeks to take him into town. And a lot of times my grandmother used to send either her homemade cookies or homemade canned candy to Miss Jubilee. But this particular time, she had finally made Miss Jubilee a quilt. And the first time I met her, she was so scary because she was just that old. She had hair. She had hair growing from her face, and she was just her eyes sit way back in the back of her head. Like I mentioned in the book, you could sit a penny on the crevices that her eyes were so set so far back in her face that you can just sit a penny there and it wouldn't drop. And the first time I met her, she was very scary. My grandfather didn't like sitting around talking to her, and he always expressed that to my grandmother before, and said he would just drop me off at Miss Jubilee's, and then he would go on to town and would leave me there. So that's how I got to know Miss Jubilee. But that one particular time when I went to see Miss Jubilee, I went and take her quilt, and she pulled out the quilt from the bag and she started looking at it and she started crying, and I didn't know what to do because I thought she would fall apart because she was so old. But my grandmother had made her a quilt of souls out of the clothing of her parents who were sold in slavery. Miss Jubilee described me how she saw her parents and her youngest sibling sold away. And I'm thinking that she may have been 5 or 6 at the time, but just to hear that and just go over that in my mind over the years, it became, like I said, I saw it as a child, but then as I got older, I start seeing it through adult lenses. And Miss Jubilee would tell me the same story over and over and over again, typical what that a lot of elderly people in the South did, that they tell you the same story over and over again. So just sitting there listening to her over the years and her ghost stories and the stories of her parents, and Miss Jubilee dabbled in the and I don't want to call it black magic, but she dabbled in herbs, and she told me how she put a spell on the ex-slave master who sold away her parents and her sibling. And it was amazing. She had amazing stories, and I never ever forgot the stories, because the stories that these older women told for a young child, it really, really, really was it was really remarkable. It was more remarkable because I was able to remember that. And the reason some people ask me, well, how do you remember all those stories? It's because I tell them the same way I remember the three little bears and the three little pigs, which I can still quote you word for word about how the house burned down. And it was the same way with their stories. They were just so amazing. I learned them until they became rote in my mind. And Miss Jubilee was one of those women who was, had a very great impression on me. And I'll always remember her. I can even remember how she looked right now. As though she walked right in the room, I can describe you her mannerisms and the way she looked.
Well, she certainly comes off the page in your book, and it's, if I can say so, though, I still think even if they were amazing storytellers, it's still amazing that you at such a young age were so receptive, because I feel like sometimes when we're young, we don't fully realize or recognize the value of what we're hearing from our grandparents or great grandparents, even if we're lucky enough to have them around. So I do want to say that I think that's really special. We are getting some really great questions in the Q&A, so I want to go ahead and pull a few of these into our conversation. But for those of you in the audience, if you've been sitting on a question, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A. So let me figure out which one we should start with. Mary has a question about a little more about slavery in Alabama, just from what you've heard from the women that you were raised with. She notes the Emancipation Proclamation was prior to when your grandmother was born, but you, of course, knew people like Miss Jubilee, or knew women who are still telling the stories of their mothers or grandmothers who were enslaved. So can you talk a little more about, especially at such an impressionable age when you were hearing these stories, learning about enslavement in that way from those firsthand experiences that you were hearing kind of in your day-to-day life?
Okay, she wants to know some of the experiences that I had with those women.
Yeah, and how was it, like, what did you learn about what their lives were like through that storytelling, rather than how a lot of people and now, of course, learn it, which is through a textbook, right?
Right, exactly. And I think about that a lot because I can compare it to, like, you have children now, like my grandchildren, they have these superheroes. Miss Jubilee and those women that I met, they were like superheroes to me. My grandmother's sister Ella, the one that perished, she was like a superhero to me. She was like my grandmother. Miss Jubilee was the same way. I really, really was amazed with what they had lived with. And the older I got, the more I was more amazed at what they were able to endure. And at going into my teenage years and adult, these people became more and more a part of my life. It's like I had the opportunity to talk with these women, and it's another part of my book, but I went through quite a bit of trying times as a teenager. And it was these women who kept me, from falling down on my face. My grandmother and these women had already built a foundation for me. So by the time I went back to Detroit, and start getting involved with running away from home and, being, these women kept me upright. I would remember some of the things that they would say. My grandmother would always tell me, whenever you're feeling down, you just look at what your Aunt Ella had to go to. Look at what Miss Jubilee had to go. And that's what kept me strong, even in the military, being deployed. That kept me strong to be able to endure some really horrendous situations that I found myself in. So these women's, I think about, that how close they were to slavery and some of the things they had to endure. And I still shake my head because by the time I started to school, we would have what we call show and tell day, where we had to get in front of the class and tell stories about, some kids would get up and they would tell the Fun with Dick and Jane stories or the Three Little Pigs stories or some other childish story that that they had made up. Myself, I used to get up in front of the class and tell the stories about my grandmother's, the stories that she told from the Quilt of Souls, because these stories were real live stories that I could relate to. And even though I was very young, and you mentioned about how you have kids now who get involved in different things. See, in the country, I had nothing. I didn't even have playmates until I went to school. So my focus was on these older women that my grandmother would put in my midst. Those are the only people that I really was able to communicate with. That's why my grandmother always told me I had an old soul, because these were not my peers, but at the same time, they were interesting women. And I kind of I just gravitated to their stories. And I never forgot the stories. As I got older, I would write down bits and pieces because I never, ever wanted to forget. And just to drive that point home, my grandmother, at one point, she took me to an old slave cemetery, which was maybe about 800 feet from the farmhouse that I was raised in. And I always wanted to go to this, what they call the old time religious cemetery. And I would always inquire about it because they would always mention it. I would hear people come over to my grandparents' house as I'm laying up under the house, listening to the adult conversation. They would talk about this old slave cemetery. And I was always curious of what was there. I always wanted to see it. And I asked my grandmother one day, and she decided to take me there. So she took me, walked with me over to this old cemetery. And she said, "You see these people laying here? I mean, it was like rocks. That's the only way, that's the only indication that you had that someone was buried there, because of the wooden cross, rocks with something written on it, and piecemeal type headstones." And she said, "You see these people laying here? Well, these are the best stories that you ain't never heard." And that stuck with me. I mean, that my grandmother had a lot of words of wisdom that if you look, as you read through the book, you will see things that she says, and it's like, wow, geez. And as I entered into adulthood, and even at the age now, I still think about those things and find a lot of meaning in the things that she said. But as we got ready to leave the cemetery, I was turning around. I was going to look back because I wanted to glance at it one more time, because I know she would never, ever take me again. So as I glanced back, she stopped me in my tracks and she said, "I don't ever want to see you looking back at them, ever. Only go." In her own, I'm going to paraphrase her, in her own words, what she was trying to say was, "I want you to only look forward and remember what you've seen here today." And that stuck with me.
That's beautiful. And what stuck with me, there's a lot of wisdom, as you say in the book, but your grandmother was very focused on looking forward and on
Mhm.
moving forward. And she had this incredible ability to empathize with people from many, many different circumstances, even people that, as you read the ways that they were acting, might not have deserved her empathy, right?
Right.
But something I wrote this down. She wrote, she was this towards the end of the book, and she wrote, quote, "Grandma never wants you to look at the bad in folks and go backward. I want you to look at the good in them and go forward."
Right.
And I just
Yes.
wonder if you could talk about her attitude towards forgiveness and
Mm.
how that helped you as you entered into some pretty, trying times after your time in Alabama.
Well, I know, and I used to think about my grandmother and what type of woman could be that forgiving, because she was a very forgiving person. And I give you a good example is that one of the most difficult chapters that I had to write was this chapter called "Twixt Laurel and Livingston." And that was a very, very, very difficult chapter for me to write. And I would write it and I would send it to my publisher and they would send it back. They said, "No, you're missing something. You're not expressing something. You're holding back on something." And I was holding back because it was so difficult for me to write, because that was, and I will consider that and call that the forgiveness chapter, because what happened to my grandmother on that road between Laurel and Livingston, was just, how could a woman be that forgiving after what she had endured on that road from Sheriff Suggs? And she was able to forgive him and move on. I'm the one had a problem um, with the forgiveness piece. And she tried to bring me into that, telling me that I need to learn how to walk in someone else's shoes. And I took that literally, because I would find old pair of shoes, Miss Jubilee's, and I would just get in their shoes and just walk, thinking that I could gain this forgiveness piece that she had, but it just wasn't working. But because I was taking it literally like that. And it wasn't until years later that I was able to recognize what my grandmother was trying to say about forgiveness, because she had an overwhelmingly ability to forgive, even in the most worst circumstances. Even though I didn't write all the stories that she was able to forgive people, because it was just too many. But I would just sometimes, just even today, I sit back and wonder how could she do it? How could she be so given? Because if she wasn't forgiven, she was giving away. She was giving things to people. She would. My grandmother was still farming and plowing, even in her 80s, and she would raise these big crops, even in her 80s, and she would give all the stuff away. She would can fruit and jellies, but we barely had stuff for ourselves because she would give it away. And I used to just hate it, because I wanted to hog a lot of that for myself. And I was just, it just, even today, I look back and see how just the person that she was. She endured, the perseverance and the ability to forgive and the resilience that this woman had inside of her was just, you just don't see that today.
We have a good question from the audience here that I think is a good segue for us. So this is from Kimberly, and she says, as it relates to Miss Jubilee, but I'll extend this to all of the stories that you tell, so like sensitively in this book. But as it relates to that, were you concerned with telling too much? So can you talk about that struggle with wanting to be true to the stories, but deciding
Yeah.
how much needed to be put out into the world in this particular format?
Yeah, I thought about it and I said, well, if they were here, how much would they would like for me to expose to the world? And then I had to answer the question, well, they told the story so many times and the story never ever changed. So sometimes I had to go back to, like, maybe it was just serendipitous for me to tell the story and to tell it the way that they told it to me, and not to leave out anything. And because if they did, they were these women who didn't even have never had any formal education, so it had to be difficult for them to tell the story. But they was able to tell it, and I was able to understand it. And so I had a choice whether I wanted to tell their entire story or just tell bits and pieces of it. And so I just chose to tell the entire story. And it hurt. It was difficult for me. It really was. This was a difficult book to write. That's why it took so long to write. But I didn't want to leave out anything, because the book is paying homage to these women who gave so much and received so little. And their stories, so many of their stories are untold. And we just don't hear about these grandmothers who did so much to raise their children's children. And you really don't hear very much about that. And I wanted to make sure their stories were told in its entirety.
I think that makes so much sense. And, from just trying to get a holistic understanding of that time period, it's
Right.
essential. Sabrina has a good question. She wants to know, in your opinion, why do you think you or other children were not told why they were being sent to their grandparents? Or in some cases, not only with you, but with some of the other women you write about, it was very much a secret, why they were being sent away. Why do you think that was when it was so common?
Yeah, I think about that a lot too. And as a child back in those days, and I think quite a few people in the audience can relate to it. but you just really never asked the grown-up questions. That was children were to be seen and not heard. So I never asked. Even as I got older, my mother had a really difficult time talking to me about it. And I still to this day, I don't know the answer to that. Just like a lot of my peers who I went to school with, they probably never got the answer either to that question. But something that I did find out, and I was talking to a couple of my classmates, that people like my mother, parents who were born in the 1920s or 1930s, they were less forthcoming than my grandparents. My grandparents, the people of my grandmother's era divulged more information than the people of my mother's era. And that's always seemed like a real big question mark. Why was that? But I really do believe that when a lot of the parents sent their children back south and these children stayed down there to adulthood, you always going to carry that abandonment issues with you. Why was I chosen out of 8, like myself, out of 8 children? Why was I the one? And so I guess I have to just go back to say that, I know that I really do feel that I was sent because I was the one that was going to tell the story. I had that gift. I think that was an innate gift that I have and continue to have, to write and to tell the story and to be a storyteller. So I was the storyteller out of the bunch, and that's how I justify my being sent away. But that's a very difficult question, but because I know a lot of my people my age probably still asking that same question, and so that's why I related back to going up north. I look at it in a socioeconomic situation. They just couldn't afford their kids, so they sent them back south because that was a difficult time for them, during that Great Migration, because there was a transition and acclimation period that for them to be sent. For them to go from the south to north, and they still had some of the same issues with racial issues that people were having in the south. So I kind of like chalk that up to this is a situation that happened, and because of that, because of being in that migration, that Great Migration, they just could not afford their children. So
Yeah, moving a family now is difficult, right?
right,
But
exactly.
especially thinking about moving with,
Mhm.
sometimes 6, 7, 8 or more
Right,
children to an unfamiliar place where you may or may not know anybody with, as you say, while discrimination and racism might have looked slightly different in some ways in the North, it was, obviously very prevalent there as well.
exactly.
I can't imagine what that would have been like overall. So that's a really empathetic way to look at that.
Right.
Um, I was wondering, there's a question here from Sylvia that relates to today, and I know given your experience working, as a counselor and with all different types of people who are struggling, you might have some insight into this. First of all, she says this is great storytelling of strong women, and she's very thankful to hear of them and validate them. She asks, research tells us that there are many grandparents rearing grandchildren today. What do you think is different today than maybe this dynamic in the past?
Probably especially the rural setting, and look at the time period too. You know, um, Children now have, of course, more options. I didn't even hadn't even watched the television until I was like 10. So, technology is that I would chalk that up as one of the biggest difference. And then being raised in the South, especially the rural South, is so much different than being raised, up north now and before, because you still have children who live on the farm. Now children back then during my era had a larger responsibility. I was 6 years old, 6 and 7. I was walking to school for 2.5 miles by myself in a rural environment. Children now catch school buses, and so technology is a big part of that. But that's not to say that grandparents now or grandmothers now, have that same role that they play in their grandchildren's life. Even though you have technology, but grandparents' role, I think grandmothers or grandparents, well, specifically grandmothers, I think that's a very underrated demographic, that still don't get as much credit as they deserve. But the grandmothers, of my era, they were born in a different time, 1880s, 1870s, 1860s, 18, their mindset was different. They didn't have the education, and they only knew what they knew. Their parents were slaves, so that's what they knew. And then they were farm workers, they were butter churners, they were laundresses. There was no technology, so I think that's probably the biggest difference.
Makes a lot of sense. We have a few questions here from the audience about quilting itself. So I wanted to make sure we made some time for that because we see some beautiful work on display behind you. But the first question is from Sabrina. I'm going to read the whole comics. It's very sweet. She says, Miss Phyllis, you look amazing. I remember my grandmother and great grandmother quilting on the weekends. I didn't appreciate it then. So I absolutely love your story. I admire the fact that you learned to appreciate quilting and the stories when you were younger, and she wants to learn how to quilt, and she'd like to know your advice for getting started.
Oh, join a quilting guild. That's one of the best things that she can do to get started, because the quilting guilds are really good at teaching people to quilt, especially people who have no idea how to get started, because it's a process to quilting. Like my grandmother, she quilted hand sewed, and because we didn't have any electricity, so she made all her quilts needle and thread, hand sewn, every stitch straight. But joining a quilting guild and because they have some great people, they have some great teachers in the quilting guild. I haven't quilted since I was with my grandmother as a preteen. That was the last time I quilted, but I would love to get back into it because quilting is therapeutic. Quilting for those women of my grandmother's era, I think it was very cathartic. That's how because I would watch them sit around the quilting horse, and the women, they would tell their stories. They would tell a lot of stories about slavery, about what they were going through currently, and so that was cathartic for them. And those were great times. That was when a bunch of women would get together and they would talk about their sorrows and their fears, and it's a little bit of everything was thrown in. And since I couldn't sit around and watch, I would crawl up under the house and just sit there, with the chickens, and just listen to these old women tell their stories. And it was just so amazing. I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. Learning about quilting, I really would not trade that for anything.
It was cathartic and communal, which I think I love about how quilting guilds now try to keep that spirit alive. Because even in my family, my grandmother talks about how her mother is the same thing. They would get all of the women together, would come into the house and work on, hand sewing these quilts. So it was a Southern, I think, experience, and I love that it's being kept alive.
Yes.
These are so special. Karen wants to know if your grandmother had favorite patterns for the quilts she made. So how'd she go about actually putting those beautiful pieces together?
She had just like with her Quilt of Souls, for instance, which is behind me now, and the first piece went in 18, I would say maybe 1860 or so. But it was my grandmother, since she only made quilts from people's clothing who had passed on. It was she had a way a way or a reason how she placed the different pieces in the quilt. Just like my quilt, it wasn't completed until it took 10 years for her to complete. And there was a reason, because she knew whose clothing would be going in the quilt, and the placement of it. And she wanted to make sure she placed those pieces together. It was almost like a storybook, and the quilts and the pieces, they tell a story. And it was for me how she had joined the pieces together. And there's some forgiveness pieces in there. And she wanted me to know every time I looked at how those pieces are placed in the quilt, that I'm going to think about how I need to forgive people for the things that they do, and it would make me a better person. So the way the pieces are fit in the quilt are instrumental, and at least my grandmother's the way she made quilt, and I'm pretty sure that's standard for a lot of other quilters, because I was at a quilting guild not long ago, and I was telling them, when you make the making of quilts is what you're thinking about while you're making it. What stories are you telling yourself? What are you thinking about? What areas in your life are soothing and comforting when you quilt? It kind of takes away pain and a lot of sorrows and a lot of hurt sometimes, because all of those emotions are in the quilt. And I know I would look at my grandmother when she quilt, and I could see those same emotions tied up as she sewed the different pieces in there. And telling the stories while she was sewing them was so instrumental, because once she finished, that was closure for her. And I learned later on that it was closure for me as well when she finished and completed my quilt.
I just had a question submitted right before you started that answer, asking about elaborating further on how quilts tell stories. So you totally anticipated that question. It's it's such a reminder of how tangible artifacts, that we pass through our families, can be those reminders of those stories. Carol wrote in with a question. She said, "I applaud you for taking such intimate family stories and bringing those to life. Could you talk about let me see if I can. Okay. Can you talk about your writings, knowing that these oral history stories have to be published and shared in written form?" So I know that you probably heard dozens more stories and went into the book. So how did you decide how to tell them, and then which ones to tell?
That was difficult too, because actually the book was 300 pages more, but it was cut down by the publisher because they wanted to kind of like make it two books. But that was the difficult piece, and more than anything, I have, not a huge amount of dialogue, but just enough to express what I'm trying to get across to the reader. So the dialogue was difficult, because the dialogue of the different people, it has to be consistent, and making that consistent piece was very, very difficult, because you can't say a word one way by the same person, and then the next you turn a page over, it's spelled different. So it was really difficult marrying that dialogue. But I did have a difficult time with the stories. Some stories, like I said before, were very difficult to tell, and actually I left off some of the painful stories. Maybe in the next book I'll be able to get that piece out. But the most difficult piece in doing a memoir, for anyone, is how much you're going to tell, how much you want to expose of yourself. What are people going to think? How are family members are going to react? And so all that goes into writing. And so a lot of times you hold back, sometimes unintentionally, but at the same time, intentionally. And that's why when you get a good editor, they are able to point that out and say, whoa, wait a minute, back up. You held out something. And so it was easy for me to write the story because of my love for my grandmother and the women that I was surrounded by growing up. So that piece was easy. It was easier to tell their story than to tell my reaction to their story. That's a good way of describing it. But I wanted to really, really, really pay homage to these women. And so that was the easy part, because I have such admiration for these women and what they went through. That part was really, really easy. The most difficult part is the pain that they had to go through as a result. And so I was able to step into their shoes, as my grandmother would say, and feel their pain. And it definitely comes out in the story, because I saw myself in their story. And so it became easier for me to write it.
Thank you for that. I got a point of clarification from one of the questions, so I want to make sure I'm asking it correctly.
Oh,
Yeah, I
okay.
would like to know. Um, they said that in addition to the family stories that quilts can capture, there's also a really rich history of quilting in the African and African American community about Underground Railroad routes,
Mhm.
escape routes, safe houses, etc. Could you talk a little bit about that part of quilting history as well?
Oh, sure. And I get that a lot because, you have a faction of quilters that really don't believe in the slave in the Underground Railroad philosophy that the quilts told stories, and then you have a large faction who do believe that. And and to be very honest with you, if I hadn't heard it with my own ears growing up as a child, I would say, no, that's probably another one of the, it's probably folklore or superstition. But now, growing up with these women, there wasn't a lot of superstition. I've moved superstition completely out of the realm of possibilities. But I used to lay up under the house, and I would hear them talk about how they used to hang quilts on the trees, and they would tell the person who was escaping to slavery which way to go. Some quilts, and I've seen these quilts, down south all my life with the water and the railroad tracks and the trees and a person standing up under a tree. So it just told a story. It was almost like a road map. And what really made me realize, yes, these quotes did tell story. My great grandfather, Josh Horn, was one of the most interviewed slaves in the slave narratives. And his son, my grandfather, told me one time, because my great grandfather Josh wrote a story called Chasing Guinea Jim. My great grandfather supposedly trained dogs to hunt slaves down. And my grandfather told me more than once, if Guinea Jim hadn't hid up under the house, and if he only had followed the quilts that was hanging in the tree, he wouldn't have got captured. And my grandfather was always telling me this story. And the story, you can read about it in Josh's slave narratives about Guinea Jim, who ended up being caught up under one of the houses. So I truly, truly believe that these quilts were used as markers for slaves to escape. My quilt that I have railroad track designs in it as well, and that's no fluke. That was one of the main pieces that they put in quilts back then, was those railroad track markings, which was typical for a lot of quilts that they made back then. My great aunts made quilts with railroad trackings and trees, and I know it was passed down. So yes, I totally believe in that slaves did use those quilts to escape to freedom.
So very interesting. I have two questions from Larry, which are both super fun. Larry, his first one is a comment. He said, "Hey, cuz, the tradition continued on a stump behind the smokehouse. We were in charge of rinsing and
Yeah,
hanging the clothes. Then we took a bath in the big tub in the
yeah, yeah. That's my cousin. We were down there at the same time, so he
yard."
knows he knows the story.
Ah, that's so fun. Hi, Larry. Thanks for
Yeah,
being here virtually tonight.
yeah.
His other question is, we used to sleep under those quilts. We slept in the same bed across from grandma and grandpa. So my question is, how many quilts was on the bed? Were they heavy to you? Because I couldn't move.
I couldn't either. Yeah, and once you get them, you get stuck. You don't want to move. Yeah. So I would say only took a couple of those quilts to put you in the position where you couldn't move, because they were heavy. They really were. And I think he picked some of the same cotton I did to fill the quilts with.
Maybe that was a strategy to keep
Yeah.
the kids from getting up to trouble, running away at night. Well, we're getting towards the end of our time. I put a comment in the Q and or in the chat. We have a lot of great comments coming in. So to everyone in the audience, rest assured, I will be sure they're passed along to Phyllis via email, since we're not going to be able to get to all of them in tonight's conversation. But Yolanda had a question about just the process of bringing your book to life. She says, what was a challenging or fun thing that you learned about the publishing industry as you brought your memoir to the marketplace? And I know we could probably have a whole other
Oh yeah.
event about this, but just something that really stood out to you about the process.
Oh, the process, I think one of the greatest things that stood out was the editorial process because, I can laugh at it now, but back then it wasn't fun because I remember my first editorial review. I didn't know what an editorial review was. And you finish with the book and it's complete. So then it goes through the editorial review. And my editor was great. I mean, she was good. She did some of the editorial work for the Twilight series. So she was really, really good. But the first editorial review I got was about 50 pages. It was about that thick. And I'm, wow, geez. And my agent said, Phyllis, don't be intimidated, just read through it. And of course, she listed all the great things, all the positive things in the book. Then it got into the more critical pieces, and I'm reading and I'm crying. Oh my gosh, how am I going to ever do this? So it took about 3 months to get to get through that editorial review, just for a few months later to get another editorial review where it got smaller. Maybe it went to 25 pages, then it went to 10 pages, and then a couple, and I was there. But it wasn't very funny in the beginning, but after I look in retrospect, if I look back on it, I go back to how I actually felt when I got those reviews. I kind of felt like I was a failure in a lot of ways, but my agent had told me that don't feel like that. This is the critical review. This is what you're going to have to go through as an author, and it worked. It really was. So it wasn't fun, but it was fun writing it. It was fun going through the review and seeing what I need to change. And once I did change it, how good it sounded. It just sounded beautiful after I finished. But when I first looked at it, I said, "There's no way I would like to keep it the way it is." But uh, it worked.
Good editors can be truly, truly magical. Well,
Yes.
as we get to the end of our time tonight, I'm going to give everyone else a verbal reminder if you have not yet purchased your copy of Quilt of Souls, it is available in Atlanta History Center's museum shop. But just to close out tonight, so you tell this story through the lens of your childhood, your interactions with your grandmother and all the women in her community. Um, and the stories of her life and those people around her, they weren't just theirs, they were the story of the entire community. And that complete story does not always get in all of the history books, right?
Right.
But you have them now. Um, but sometimes I found that people don't think that their stories are important. Like they're just normal or they're just the everyday, ordinary things.
Mhm.
So they don't necessarily think about how they should be preserving their stories or how they should be passing them down. And we lose that richness of the everyday experience when we aren't able to get those things from people firsthand.
Right.
And we're losing, a lot of our elders always, but all of us are getting older too, right?
Right.
So for those in the audience, I was wondering what advice you could give to engaging in both their own personal stories and that of their family and their community in their own lives, so they can start to adapt some of the storytelling tradition to preserve that history.
I believe that everybody has a story, but it's just you have to make that choice to write it. And it's a choice that you have to make, and it's not easy. Some people have led lives that's really, really powerful. But you have to make the choice whether or not you want to write it or not. But I even go back further. I tell people that if you don't get the story from your elders now, once they're gone, it goes right to the cemetery with them, and you'll never be able to get that story. And I've talked to people who don't know who their grandparents were. I mean, this is one generation back. They don't know who their great grandparents were. And these people, I'm a firm believer that these people had great stories, had great stories to tell, but the people, they didn't talk to their elders. Now we're living in a different time where the stories don't are not as interesting to some, even though, I mean, to them, there's not interesting, but there are great stories out there. But we don't sit down and talk to our elders like we used to. That the tradition of passing on oral history has all but faded away. And that's devastating because you're going to lose a lot in the process. You're not going to know who those grandparents were, great grandparents were, people who were, World War II heroes. You're just not going to know anymore. My father, for instance, I sat down and talked to him. He was 95 years old, but I recorded his story about fighting in World War II. He was on the Normandy he was on the ship that landed in Normandy. And for him to talk about, General Patton, and he knew soldiers I would never knew that if I hadn't have recorded and if I hadn't actually sat down and told him. I would have never believed my father did something that interesting, but that's the only way you're going to find out. But like I said, that tradition is dying and people are not getting that oral history from their elders any longer. I talked to a woman who was in a nursing home and nobody come to visit her. She's 90 something and she has the most amazing stories. And she said, nobody ever comes to talk to me about it. My grandkids don't want to hear it. So, and that's the worst. I mean, that is devastating. It really is. So, but I think like I said, everybody has a story to tell. They just have to decide whether they want to put pen to paper and do it, because you're gonna lose some really great and interesting books if you don't.
Well said. Well, I hope everyone in the audience is inspired like I am to pick up the phone and call if you're lucky to have them, your grandparents or, whomever in your life, or call your grandkids and talk to them about it. But we are at the end of our time tonight. I wish that we could just keep talking for hours more, Phyllis, because this has just been wonderful. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time with us tonight, but also, of course, with your family's history and your history through your memoir. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Glad to be here.